Good morning, Happy New Year to everyone, and welcome to the first meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2021. Please ensure all mobile phones are in silent. And just a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. Agenda item 1, with consideration of whether to take agenda items 6 and 7 in private. Item 6 is consideration of the evidence heard today on the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015. Agenda item 7, the committee will consider a draft letter to the Scottish Government and Common Frameworks Hazardous Substances. Under this item, members are also asked to agree to take in private future consideration of our draft report on the European Charter of Local Self-Government Corporation Scotland Bill. As we are meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you are content. Does anyone object? Okay, thank you very much. In that case, that is agreed. Items 6 and 7 will be taken in private. Future consideration of a draft report on the European Charter of Local Self-Government and Corporation Scotland Bill will also be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence on the draft Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020, Meetings of Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, Coronavirus Number 2, Regulations 2020. And I welcome Elaine Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, Caroline Monk, Senior Policy Officer, and Jamie McQueen, SGLD Lead for the SSI's Scottish Government. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion to approve the instrument. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. Before we proceed, 2 corrections to points in the clerk's paper, both are at paragraph 10 of the paper. First, we understand the instrument came into force on 30th December and not immediately on being laid. Secondly, the Parliament has 40 days and not 28 days to decide whether to approve the instrument. It is currently in force, but it requires parliamentary approval to remain in force. And I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Convener, and Happy New Year to all the committee members. And I welcome the opportunity to join the committee to put forward this motion to recommend that the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020, Meetings of Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, Coronavirus Number 2 Regulations 2020 be approved. The UK Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020 allowed Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, known as SCIOs, and other bodies to hold remote meetings with their members during the relevant period, even where their constitution would not normally allow this. The relevant period originally ran from the 26th of March to the 30th of September. The Act allows for Scottish ministers to extend the relevant period for SCIOs by 3 months at a time, and the Scottish Parliament approved a previous set of regulations which extended the relevant period to the 30th of December. SCIOs are legally required to hold certain meetings, but with the current COVID-19 restrictions, those members' meetings in person will not be possible. These further regulations allow SCIOs to continue to hold remote meetings with their members, even where their constitution would not normally allow this until the 30th of March 2021. So these regulations are a final extension to the relevant period for SCIOs, and look forward to taking any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We now move on to questions from members. If you have a question, I'd be grateful if you notify us via the digital channels available to you. Just type R and I will call anyone who wants to ask a question in turn by name, and please allow a second for your microphone to be operated. And Cabinet Secretary, please state clearly if an official has been brought in to answer any questions. Does anybody have any questions? No? In that case, we'll move to agenda item 3. Agenda item 3 is formal consideration of motion S5M 23666, calling for this committee to recommend approval of the draft Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020, Meeting of Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, Coronavirus Number 2, Regulations 2020. So made affirmative. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion and speak to it if she has anything further to add.
No, I move that the Local Government and Communities Committee recommends that the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020 Meetings of Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations Coronavirus Number 2 Regulations 2020 be approved.
Thank you very much. I invite contributions from members. If you'd like to contribute to the debate, please let me know by typing R into digital channels or raising your hand. Okay, nobody's asked. So the question is that motion S5M 2366 in the name of Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government Planning be approved. Are we all agreed? Okay, Jess. Thank you. That is agreed. So the committee has agreed on the motion S5M 2366. Thank you. Committee will report on this instrument in due course. I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary and officials for taking part in this meeting. Members of the panel not taking part in the next item can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon, and I remind committee members that they remain in public for the next item. I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. 2 minutes would do fine. At item 4, the committee is taking evidence on post-legislative scrutiny of the Community Empowerment Act 2015, parts 3 and 5, which relate to participation requests by community groups and asset transfers to community groups. Today we are taking concluding evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government on the themes which have emerged throughout our scrutiny. And I welcome back Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, and also Kathleen Glazick, Community Empowerment Team Leader, and Malcolm Cowie, Policy Lead for Asset Transfer and Participation Requests, Scottish Government. Thank you for all being here today. We have just over an hour for this session, if required. Some brief technical information. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. Please could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. Thank you. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Thanks, Convener, and I'd like to start by thanking the committee for inviting me to give evidence today and for the work that you've been undertaking today on scrutinising these two parts of the Community Empowerment Act, and also to pay tribute to the many community groups and partners who've done so much to establish participation requests and community asset transfers across the country. In my opening remarks, I want to reaffirm the value the Scottish Government places on community empowerment. Our policies are at the heart of the strengthening local voices to be heard and listened to in the decisions that matter most to them, and for communities to take control of the assets that also matter most to them. We all want to see a Scotland in which everyone can play a full part in society, and that ambition can be demonstrated by the legislation we've introduced, such as the Community Empowerment Act, which has signalled a significant transfer of powers to communities across Scotland. This aspiration is backed by sustained funding and our policies, including participation requests and asset transfer requests that enable communities to have more control over the decisions that affect them, helping local people to develop their own economies, their wellbeing and environments. Participation requests and asset transfer request legislation have been enforced for nearly 4 years now, and during that time we commissioned Glasgow Caledonian University researchers to evaluate both policies on our behalf. Although only required by Parliament to evaluate on participation requests, we quickly realised the benefits of conducting an evaluation on both policies, and the final Glasgow Cali evaluation reports are providing invaluable knowledge for us to further develop our approaching policies. But we recognise we cannot do this work on our own. In previous sessions of this committee, you've heard from some of our partners we have worked closely with over these last 4 years since the legislation came into being. Organisations such as the Community Ownership Support Service and the Scottish Community Development Service told us of the value of partnership working in promoting parts 3 and 5 of the Act, and of their work in promoting and sharing good practice. Leslie Forsyth from North Ayrshire Council spoke about their work on community engagement and the cultural shift that was developing from being a customer of the council to an actively involved citizen. Elizabeth Manson from Dumfries and Galloway Council spoke of the value of good community engagement and how they work closely with their communities to help them achieve their goals. All of these colleagues had one thing in common, and that was their regular use of well-connected networks and partnerships to achieve their community goals. And that is why developing and maintaining a close, constructive partnership between ourselves, our partners and our communities has also always been a key priority for this government. And this is something that we not only work hard to achieve, but also greatly value. And to give a picture of our successes and the mechanisms we have put in place through our Joined Up Working, we have provided and maintained sustained funding to the Community Ownership Support Service and the Scottish Community Development Centre to embed asset transfer and participation requests throughout Scotland, with a focus on reaching out to marginalised communities and those experiencing disadvantage. We've acted upon the Glasgow Cali University evaluation report into asset transfer activity by establishing a national asset transfer action group to take forward its findings and recommendations. And this group is made up of community representation and asset transfer stakeholders and relevant authorities, and is providing the necessary direction to embed and strengthen our policy. We've put supportive solutions in place for relevant authority annual reporting by developing an annual reporting template with our partners, and this was used for the first time in 2020 and not only improved reporting levels but provided greater depth of local knowledge, helping our understanding of asset transfer activity levels across Scotland. And we have worked directly with individual relevant authorities to provide support and guidance as they have established their own practice and methods to promote these policies. So those are just some examples of how we are embedding participation requests and asset transfers across Scotland. As we look forward, we are keen to give more control to our communities and to continually work with our partners and communities to make processes easier to navigate, especially for those harder to reach communities. We're developing work that directly responds to the knowledge that we have built up so far from community feedback, from partner and stakeholder advice and guidance, from our own data and information analysis, and from the work of the evaluations that have been carried out on our asset transfer and participation request policies. So we'll continue to monitor levels of engagement, data and uptake of these policies, and we'll work with our partners to understand this information and act on what it tells us. And finally, we're looking forward to receiving the findings of the work of this committee on asset transfers and participation requests, and thank all members for taking such a close interest in this work. So thank you, Convener. I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We will now move on to the questions, but Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you as always to please state clearly if an official is going to be brought in to answer any questions. And I'll begin by asking whether the Minister agrees that the implementation and delivery of Parts 3 and 5 of the Act have been patchy, and if so, how will the Government address these inconsistencies? Okay, so since 2017, there has been 249 asset transfer requests made and over 63 participation requests submitted throughout Scotland using these new powers. But we also recognise that we need to understand
their effectiveness, and we need to ensure everyone can benefit from them. So that essentially is why I pointed out the research that we commissioned from Glasgow Caledonian University to carry out evaluation of both parts of those acts, to monitor the activity levels, to help us understand the effectiveness of these policies, and to help hopefully ensure over time that we can adapt and mould and shift and change approaches where that is necessary. So we have acted quickly and early on these findings, and we've put in place funding to support communities through the Community Ownership Support Service and the Scottish Community Development Centre to carry out bespoke work in areas of low or no uptake. So we've been able to use some of that research and finding, and then to kind of further then target areas where we know we need to make some improvement. But so there's always room for improvement. We've put in place evaluation and monitoring approaches. We're taking action as a result of what that tells us, and we'll continue to take that approach as we go forward. But again, I think in something like this, there will always be need to improve and always be need to be agile to make sure that we respond to the needs of communities and to help support them in the best way that we can.
Thank you for that. Do you feel that the communities across Scotland have been more empowered as a result of Parts 3 and 5 of the Act? And if you do feel that, how is the Scottish Government measuring the effectiveness of this legislation?
So again, I think that comes back to some of the funding and that we put in place to get the Glasgow Caledonian University to evaluate some of these approaches and to study the effectiveness of the Parts 3 and 5 of the Act. And so from their research, we know that the legislation is working as intended and that activity is increasing year on year. So I gave you some of the numbers there about how many participation requests and how many asset transfer requests have happened as a result of the legislation. But again, this will always continue to need for us to be agile, adaptable, and to work with our communities and to support those communities where we need to put a bit more effort into ensuring that they can realise the opportunity that can be got for them through this legislation. So I would hope that people and communities feel more empowered, but I think it also goes along with a number of other areas of policies that we're taking forward, whether that's through the local governance review, whether that's through participatory budgeting and others. And there's always more we can do to empower our communities so that they feel that they have agency and empowerment within the decisions that affect them most.
Thanks for that. One of the things that came across pretty loud and clear in the evidence sessions we had, certainly from the organisations that had tried to participate or in any way, was the need for a person at the top of each public body to be responsible for ensuring community empowerment, because very often what they found was that they were talking to somebody that was further down in the food chain, to use a phrase, and then their requests sort of dissipated. Would you agree that it would be a good way to do it, to have somebody who has got some influence within local authorities, for example, to be the person that the communities could contact about the community empowerment work?
So we're absolutely aware of that finding from the research that Glasgow Cali took in their evaluation report, and that is being considered as part of the wider response to their recommendations. But I think, in an ideal world, absolutely, you would understand the benefit of having a single person to go to. Many authorities do have that. They've already established a single point of contact in place and have highlighted the advantages that has brought to them. And of course, many of us, all of us in this committee, we're all constituency MSPs, will know that how much easier it is to help support your constituent or a constituency group by having a single point within an authority or within a public body to help them and support them navigate through what can be often feels like clunky bureaucratic systems. So we know that this is something that is something that's been recommended. We're taking action to work through how we might respond to that, but we're pleased that there are many authorities that do have that single point of contact in place. But there's probably, again, like everything in this area of work, always room for improvement. and also need to kind of change and shift the culture across the wider public landscape to make sure that people take this legislation seriously.
Okay, thank you for that. The only thing I would say is that what did come across was that some have got what they would say was a point of contact, but they might not have enough influence within the local authority, again, to use that as an example. And I think it would be really helpful if there was going to be a point of contact in every local authority, that person was capable of pushing things on, and it wasn't a case of they were the point of contact that then went somewhere else in the council and was never seen again or wasn't seen for some time. So I do think that should be taken into account.
Well, I think that's a good point, because it's one thing to be able to essentially tick off that is something that's in place, but it's very much another thing to make sure that is a quality offering, that is a supportive and offering as well, that's driving forward with the authority that's required to make some of these things happen. So I think that's a good point well made, and again will be part and parcel of the work that's been taken forward by the transfer group in response to the recommendations that came through from Glasgow Caledonian's evaluation report. But I think it sounds like also that this will be a heavy recommendation from the committee as well, so it'll be useful to further progress that side of things.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. One of the things that came through, just to follow up on that point, was the extent to which all communities are actually able to use these powers and to use the opportunities that come from the Act. And I would be very keen to hear what is being done both with local authorities and with other public sector organisations to ensure that people from low-income, deprived or disadvantaged communities actually know how to exercise their rights, and that those bodies are actually open to talking to them and to helping them through, if they do want to change things in their community, what can be quite a long process.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, absolutely. And again, we recognise that, and that is why we have provided funding and support to the two organisations that I mentioned previously, the Community Ownership Support Service and the Scottish Community Development Centre, and that provides free support and advice to Scotland's communities to help navigate through some of what you've described. And they have been they have been explicitly tasked now with targeting communities experiencing deprivation or disadvantage to make sure that they can realise the opportunity that exists within this legislation to help them get through some of the navigate through some of the mechanisms that are put in place to make the asset transfer or the participation request come to life. So we recognise that this is an issue that we need to tackle, and that's why we've specifically and explicitly tasked both those organisations to help support communities that require that little bit extra support and capacity. So there's always more to be done. I would look forward to any recommendations that come from the committee, but it's something that we've recognised and that we want to fix, and that's why we've taken that action. Of course, there will be more that will come through from the National Asset Transfer Action Group to further guide and advise government about what further actions may be required in this space.
Well, just thinking particularly things like some of the analysis we've got of, for example, the annual report process, that for some it's actually really useful. It flags out what's happened in the year, what progress has been made. In others, it's not at all useful. It doesn't really tell you anything. So there's something about not just meeting the letter of the law, but actually the culture in public bodies, the culture in local authorities. Conveners asked the question about a key point of contact who's not just the recipient of emails, but somebody who will actually help enable change and engage with people. And something about community capacity. One of the things that's come out really strongly in the pandemic is digital access, that many people just do not have that. And it's just focusing on the research that we saw that only 18% of the population feel that they can influence decisions affecting their local areas, and that's basically fallen from 24% since the Act received royal assent. So there's something about what are the priorities to actually accelerate the impact of this legislation, given all the feedback we've had from communities about where it's not working.
Yeah, and
what would you do to accelerate that?
Oh, sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to start replying. What did you say there lastly?
No, sorry, I realised you didn't think I'd finished my question, but it's what can be done to accelerate this process and actually get a bit of energy into it so that it is the transformation that we were hoping for?
Yeah, and again, and I think, that's why, so I think you're right. I think it's really disappointing that the Scottish Household Survey figures came with what they did. I think there's a bit of work to understand fully the context of that, to make sure that we're properly understanding what prompted that figure and what has made people feel in that way. What I would also say, though, is that this is also, I think, should be linked across to the local governance review, which we're taking forward to further empower communities, working with local government and the wider public life as well. The other thing we can point to is the participatory budgeting, which also sits in the portfolio, and that has gone from a handful of events over the last few years to 47,000 people attending events across the country or voting online, and that equates to 122,000 voters having a dividend on £6.6 million in the last few years. So again, that's a massive shift that, again, which is part and parcel of the work that we all want to see happening, which is to empower our communities to have more say, a greater sense of autonomy and agency, control over decisions that are impacting on them, and that's something that we want to continue to promote. And if there are more things that we need to do, then absolutely we will look at them. That's why we commissioned Glasgow Caledonian University to evaluate not just one part of the legislation, but two parts of the legislation to help give us a better idea about what's working, what's not, what more do we need to do. And it's why we established the National Asset Transfer Action Group to take forward those recommendations, bringing again all the kind of relevant key bodies, entities, stakeholders into a place to give us the guidance as to what do we need to do, what further actions do we need to take to drive the policy forward, because it is and does stand to be transformative, and if we get it right, make a huge difference in our communities. And I think this year, or the year just past more than most, has shown what the country stands to gain if we do have empowered communities. Communities that have shown greatest resilience have been the ones that have had community anchor organisations in place, a motivated, empowered community that has been driving forward bespoke, tailored community supports and responses in a really localised sense. But if that hadn't been there, then what would have replicated it? It would have been very difficult for the national government to have replicated it. It might have been easier for local government, but certainly it's been far better what we've seen when we see councils and work with communities and government work with communities that are able to respond to the direct needs of a community. So, there is no, I don't think, any principal disagreement with the want to try and progress this policy to further move it forward, to ensure that more people can get access to the opportunity that exists within participation requests and asset transfers, but also the wider work that we're doing on participatory budgeting, local governance review, also to flag up to the committee the forthcoming report that we'll shortly receive on town centres as well. All of that points to the need to build up and drive up capacity in communities to make sure that people can have the ability to take control. And that's possibly where there is and has been a gap, and it's one that we need to plug and make sure that communities do have the capacity. And it's not just those that have the luxury of having capacity, but is something that is equitably felt by all.
Thanks. That would be useful to come back to that in the future, definitely. I suppose the other thing is just how we log success. Some people say that if you don't have a lot of participation requests, that's success because it shows that things are working. But I was wondering, in terms of actual changes to decisions, what monitoring is going on that communities have actually changed. Public bodies, for example, we spent a lot of time talking about local government, and we got some good evidence about success and failure. But what are you doing with public bodies to get that culture shift and have the evidence that decisions have changed as a result of community engagement?
Okay, thank you. So I think that the issue around whether or not the numbers or low numbers signals success is tricky, because we do know that there'll be lots of local authorities and with well-established dialogue that have good community links that work really well and effectively, but whether or not that acts as a suppressant to participation requests is probably difficult to fully say with confidence. But again, that's why the annual reporting will be important. It's why we've got established the template to provide us with a degree of consistency, and is why it's important again to continue with the evaluation that we've supported through Glasgow Caledonian University to make sure that we get a better understanding and a much more deep, richer sense, so that we can start to draw more conclusions about what's working and why, and what that needs to mean in terms of the activity in a local authority or a public body about what they need to do and how they need to support this. But there's lots of great work happening across local authorities to support communities, but equally there's a lot of room for improvement as well. So the monitoring, the template will be really critical going forward. I think, in some of the Glasgow Caledonian research, they've also said that sometimes at this point in time it's probably too early to sort of judge success or failure at this point in time, especially with regards to participation requests, because the numbers are quite low. But it's a bit of work as well that is being looked at by the national group to continue to push forward the policy and the approach, and also to take forward the recommendations that are necessary to meet the improvements that I think we all want.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Sarah. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You've spoken today very much about the groups that have happened, the task force that's been introduced and the action groups, and they are very welcome. And when we had our engagement with organisations and individuals about the participation and about their involvement, there really was a mixed picture about what is actually happening on the ground. That became very evident, and that is evident in the report from the Caledonian University as well. So what is the role of the Scottish Government to ensure that these communities understand the challenges of asset transfer and participation, as well as the benefits of community ownership? Because there did seem to be some mismatch about what the organisations, the individuals thought they were getting involved in and what they actually did get involved in when they did participate in the process.
Okay, thank you. So, in terms of the National Transfer Action Group, the role of the government there, it convenes it. Kathleen, who's on the call with me, she chairs that group. So the government has convened a group of relevant stakeholders and groups and organisations and all sorts of entities like that to come together to work through the recommendations of Glasgow Caledonian University, to work through some of the challenges that you've described there, and to point us in the direction to how to fix that or to make improvements. So in that sense, the government is convening the kind of wide plethora of voices that are required to help us ensure that we're moving that in the right direction. In terms of helping support communities to understand what that might mean if they decide to embark upon an asset transfer or whatever, then those organisations that I have mentioned previously are the ones that we fund and support: the Community Ownership Support Service, Scottish Community Development Centre, to help support communities, to help them understand what some of this might mean for them, and to make sure that is understood, because it is a big task, and we know, and we've heard from communities as well, that it has been, if they've taken on something, that it has been a big job, a big responsibility, but we also hear that as a result of that can be something that can be transformative for a community as well, and result in positive outcomes for the community. And of course, we'll all see that in our constituencies. We'll see where communities do phenomenal things to make a difference, to make an impact, And it's important, therefore, that we don't take that for granted, that we don't just assume that that will always be there, but have to support that and help nurture that capacity so that there's no fatigue creep, or that people don't feel that they've been somehow things have been foisted upon them, because that's not what we want either. We want this to be an empowering, positive, proactive choice from communities to want to be involved in their communities and to take action and activity. And that's why we support the groups that we have and continue to work through the process of how do we further improve this really important set of policies.
Thank you. We all want it to be taken seriously, and I do believe that there are a number of councils that we went to and bodies that do take it seriously and want to engage, but there is still a low turnout, and even COSLA didn't really engage with evidence and give us information. So if we are not receiving from the powers that be within these local authorities or within these organisations a real drive or a real push, then it makes it very difficult for the community organisations and the individuals to then progress. I mean, the convener spoke about today having a link between an individual within an organisation, and I think that is vitally important if it is to be successful and is to be taken seriously. But you talked about also reporting and how that has improved. How well has the reporting improved over the time to ensure that they do actually take it seriously and want to bring these reports on an annual basis? Because they are obliged to do that, Cabinet Secretary, and many are not choosing to do or give the information that is required.
So that's why we recognised that there was a need to improve the reporting, which is why the team worked to produce the templates, so that there was something there to help prompt and promote something that was of a better standard and quality. So that's that's that continual improvement there. And in terms of how do we know people and organisations are taking it seriously, we have a range of organisations that represent huge different parts of public life on the national action group, from Transport Scotland, individual city councils, Scotland's Towns Partnership, NHS representation as well. Also, the two groups that I've mentioned that we support to support communities. So that gives a sense of the spread of organisations on the group to help drive forward improvement across the range of partners that need to see the improvement. But there is no denying that I think that we need to see a culture shift and a change across public landscape and life about how do we trust our communities, how do we respect the fact that the communities that know themselves best are those communities. They know what they need, they know how they are best placed to try and achieve that, and how do we disentangle some of the red tape and the bureaucracy that stymies some of that. I think the last 10 months or so have shown us just what we stand to achieve if we just get that right and be a bit more relaxed if things don't work as well. How do we make sure that there is an understanding that, if you take a bit of a punt on something, actually chances are it'll work really well. But if it doesn't, then what can you take from it? What learning can you take from it? How can you use that to help inform other communities that this is actually something that we thought would work, but it didn't quite? There's a lot of risk aversity in the system, and that's not just for this policy. That's across a great big swathe of life across Scotland. And actually, in this space, I think what you see, and what you achieve is that when you trust your communities, you empower them, and you support them, and you nurture them, that you stand to gain more than you lose. So again, that part of that is about the culture shift and change that we need to see across the wider public landscape. But on that point, when I engage with COSLA, for instance, the President, we've worked very well on the local governance review. We talk similarly about wanting to see our communities empowered. We, regardless of whether you're an MSP or a councillor, we represent communities that we want to see flourish and improve. And so it's in all of our interests to make sure that that is the case. And so, I think councils want this to happen. We want it to happen, but we also need to make sure that it's not just national and local government that's in this space, but the wider public landscape as well.
And finally, the timescales it takes have been very different, and there's a variety when that actually happens. If the community are transferring something like a public toilet, for example, it is easily, or it seems to be easily transmitted or handed over because both community and the local authority want that to take place, so there's a drive. Where there is log jams is where the community come along very enthusiastic about having something achieved. And then you, as you identify, Cabinet Secretary, the red tape, the bureaucracy plays in, and weeks, months and years later, they are still at the same location, and that creates real frustration in the communities. And we found that. So how do we manage to ensure that there is the impetus all the time to ensure that they get what they want within the community?
Yeah, and again, you know, that's why we have the groups in place. That's why we have the legislation, because we want to see these things happen. And you know, in terms of a public toilet, we do have examples of, you know, I think it was in Highland Council where the council asset transfer team supported the community. They were able to make the process run smoothly. They were able to support the community. Costs provided support to the community as well, and that whole process went through fairly smoothly and was a positive experience. So in pointing to those examples, it shows that it can happen well. And again, that's why the national group is really useful, because that will be able to enable us to use the good practice, to share good practice, to ensure that drives forward improvement as well, and to hopefully not make it feel such a bumpy journey for communities as you describe. I think on the whole, it shouldn't be, but we know and we have heard and we engage with communities and they've told us that that's not been their experience. So we need to try and fix some of that. But sometimes some of these things are complicated and they take time, and it's important to take the time to make sure you get it right. And again, you know, I would point back to the organisations that we fund to help support communities navigate through some of this as well. So they're not get to the end of it and are put off by it and think that this has been absolutely blooming awful and that they don't want to do anything like this again. That's not what we want. This has to be empowering and it has to be transformative and positive for communities. But sometimes it does take time, and sometimes these things, because of the nature of them, can be complex. And we wouldn't want to cut corners on that. So again, I would point to the evaluation, the reports, the action group that are bringing together people to help ensure that we can make the improvements where they are necessary.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. Gordon?
Thanks, Convener. Just to carry on the conversation regarding asset transfers, the committee heard evidence that some assets in ownership or control of certain arm's length bodies are not available for asset transfer. Audit Scotland identified 130 ALIOs across Scotland. Can you say how many ALIOs can consider asset transfers under Part 5 of the Act?
I think, you know, we recognise that some of those issues around ALIOs that you describe are and have been a barrier to some. So that is why there is further exploration of this issue around ALIOs, what more we need to do, how we ensure that ALIOs adhere to the spirit of the law, and to make sure that we certainly don't see that there's any reason for ALIOs not to adhere to the spirit of the law, but certainly it's an issue that has been pointed out, we recognise, and that's why it's currently being looked at and being explored by the action group to try and see what practical ways do we remedy some of that to enable us to relieve that barrier if that is one that's stymieing progress in this area.
And if the National Asset Transfer Action Group is looking at whether ALIOs under, is it Section 80 of the Act, should be designated as relevant authorities in future. Is there a timescale for this work to be taken forward?
So we're looking at how we might best remedy that, and that's what, so I don't have a timescale at present, but that might be something that we can further furnish the committee with if that is the route that we think is the best approach. And that's but at the moment, I think the group is looking at it. We recognise that it has been a problem in some areas. In fact, I think the convener asked me fairly recently in the chamber about this, and the National Asset Transfer Group is looking at it. We'll look at it, and we'll continue to explore that with them about how do we remedy this, because I don't think we see any reason why the ALIOs and this should be present a barrier. But if it is, then how do we fix it? What's the best way? And if there is a timescale that comes with that, then we'll let the committee know.
Thank you. And just finally, in Edinburgh, we have 3 large employers who are ALIOs in Lothian Buses, Edinburgh Leisure and Edinburgh Trams. If ALIOs were included in the list of relevant authorities, are there any concerns on the impact on these larger ALIOs?
I don't see, given what I've just said around the fact that there shouldn't be a barrier, that there's no reason for ALIOs not to act within the spirit of the law, then I can't see that there'd been anything off the top of my head that would mean that was of a negative consequence to the ALIOs. In fact, I think, on the whole, we would point to the fact that the legislation drives forward positive outcomes and positive impacts, and that our endeavour to make sure the wider public landscape is also acting in accordance to this legislation would mean that I wouldn't see why it would be negative for an ALIO. But in relation to some of those questions you've just asked around ALIOs, convener, if it's possible, I could bring in Kathleen as well, who chairs the group, who might be able to provide some further detail on that.
Yeah, of course.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Just to give some perspective, you've mentioned there are 130 ALIOs, and on the asset transfer relevant authority list we have 95 organisations. And you can add organisations, and you can delete them, or you can change them to, by designation. And we have heard concerns about ALIOs, and it's really more about transparency of who owns the asset that concerns the community. Because when they try and go through a process of trying to secure land either for lease or for purchase, they go through the local authority, and then they realise that it belongs to the ALIO. So that's where it causes confusion and concern. Now, the legislation does enable Scottish ministers to designate other organisations, and that can be done with ALIOs, as long as it's obviously a public company. And it's owned by a relevant authority. But that's also tricky as well, because some ALIOs are owned by maybe 4 different local authorities, as the case, for example, in Lothian Buses that you mentioned earlier. But it's definitely something that we are looking at, and I've developed a discussion paper for our next meeting of the Asset Transfer Action Group. And I'd also like to start conversations with my colleagues in COS who have more experience of this, and the local authorities. There are only about 10 local authorities who use ALIOs to manage their land for them. It's what I've learned from the research I've done, mainly using the Audit Scotland annual reports that come out on ALIOs each year. So we're looking at that, and we're considering it, and we can provide further information to the committee if you are interested in that.
Okay, thanks very much, convener.
Okay, thank you. Kathleen, can I just, while I've got you there, one of the issues with the ALIOs is, for example, in Glasgow, some time ago in a previous administration, but an ALIO was created solely for the purpose of getting rid of the properties that weren't being used by the City Council. And in the remit, it says that it's about raising money. The thinking behind it was pay off a mortgage that they had got to allow people over 50 to retire early. But how do you balance something that's got written into it that they're meant to raise as much money as possible with the community empowerment law?
It's a difficult one, and you've brought me now to another part that we're discussing actually tomorrow with the National Asset Transfer Action Group about social return on investment. And it's something that another paper has been recently drafted by my colleague Malcolm on that. So it is one of the challenges that relevant authorities come up against time and time again, the benefit to the public purse generally and the social benefit to the community in taking over an asset, whether it's a lease or a purchase. So it is a difficult one, and it's a discussion that needs to continue, and we're going to have with the group tomorrow, and we're looking forward to hearing their views. And again, we can feed back to the committee if that is of any help.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful if you could do that. Okay, thank you very much for that. Sorry, Andy, on you go.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to take you back to a response you made in a response to a question from Sarah Boyack about the local governance review. Because the whole question of participation requests, if you were to arrive in this country from most European countries and say that there's things called participation requests, probably look at you rather strangely, saying, well, do you not already participate in the governance of your local space? So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about how not just asset transfer and participation requests, but more generally the theme of community empowerment is being dealt with in the local governance review, and what we might expect in terms of reforms or changes that reflect the spirit of the Community Empowerment Act.
Thank you. Yeah, and the local governance review, I mean, for some of the work this last year has been delayed because of COVID as well. Some of the issues around that we wanted to progress with our communities have unfortunately had to take a bit of a hit, but we are continuing to work with local government on the local governance review around how we work with particular communities to further enable us to get a better understanding of what do we need to do to make some of the aspirations within the local governance review, the transfer of powers, come to life. And that's where we're currently at with the local governance review, that is work that's being taken forward by the team in the government there and in partnership with COSLA around how we can work with particular communities to really understand some of the barriers there and to make sure that we take together the issues around participatory budgeting, this work, and how that all enables us to realise the ambitions of empowered communities. So the local governance review, the progress hasn't been as fast over the last year for understandable reasons, but we are working with COSLA on the second phase of community engagement, and we are set out in our programme for government the intention to work out with a small number of communities to road test some of the material that has been developed as a result of the Democracy Matters work, and to ensure that we can therefore get some conclusions about how we best progress the community element of the local governance review and knit this together a bit, because there's lots of bits across the whole of government that are kind of similar territory. I mentioned to Sarah Boyack also the town centre review. I mean, some of that comes into this as well. If we have community capacity, then you can see far more successful towns where they're taken forward, if it's through business improvement districts, if it's through just more collaboration across a community to drive forward improvement across towns. I mean, some of these bits weirdly sit in different parts of my portfolio, but actually the same conversations come up time and time again, whether that's through participation requests, asset transfers, town centres, community empowerment, local governance review, they're all essentially in that kind of same territory. So I think there is a need for us to make sure that what we're doing also makes sense to communities, because I think that's been one of the other areas of that you've heard from communities, that they probably feel a bit fatigued from all the different bits of government wanting to know and consult with them about how to make things better in their community. And so I think, what we need to do and what we have the chance to do now is to try and knit this together much more effectively to make it much more impactful for communities.
Indeed, yes, because I think one of our witnesses from the communities did say that they're engaged to death by councils, but there's very little they can do, and they have very little power. At the same time, you've got one town, for example, where you have a community development trust doing various work. You've got a community council. You've got a towns partnership. There was an issue with some common good land. There had to be a ballot. People outside the 1973 borough boundary couldn't vote on that ballot because that legislation has never been updated. It was a real mess in terms of governance, and you had a lot of people who were doing the same thing, rubbing up against each other. It didn't seem very efficient, and against that background, it seems that some sort of rationalisation would be a good idea. So I wish you well with the local governance review. One of the issues...
constituency, I had that. We had to put, and sometimes as well, it's about trying to work out what is the actual barrier and what is a perceived barrier as well. And I had in my own constituency in Carluke, they have a number of, for instance, they have a number of different, they have a development trust, just like what you've described, a development trust, a business improvement district, a community council, other groups, all doing largely similar things, but kind of not working collaboratively. And so we tried to establish the one Carluke approach to try and bring everyone together, but they also had a bit of common good land as well, which I think you know about, and they had whole rigmarole to try and navigate through that to get it back into the ownership of the community. So so I think there's absolutely a lot that national government can do to try and red up the landscape a bit, but sometimes also it's about how do we support communities to recognise when something is a barrier or what is a perceived barrier, and how we can help them overcome some of that too.
Okay, that's helpful. One of the issues as well that was raised in regard to the participation request was the question of appeals from communities whose participation request had been refused. Now, this was an idea that was rejected when the bill went through, but there was a power put in place to allow that an appeals process to be developed by secondary legislation. And there was also the commitment to undertake the review, which the Caledonian University study is an expression of. Have you got any views on whether there should be a system of appeals built into participation requests?
I mean, again, I think also because the numbers have been lowish on that area, that I think sometimes it's difficult to draw a kind of a definitive conclusion from that. So again, I'm sorry if this is unsatisfactory, but I think sometimes it's about us continuing to monitor about what might be best and how we best ensure activity increases in this area, and how we can and whether or not appeals would be of benefit and of use. So it's not something we rule out, but it's something that we're continuing to look at and will continue to monitor as well. And it's particularly as it is a recommendation from the Glasgow CALI, and we've got the National Action Group there looking at those recommendations. So I don't think it's something we want to rule out, and also we'll continue to actively monitor that as a thing that would be helpful or useful in the future.
Okay, and finally, one of the problems I think that's been identified is that when Parliament passes legislation like the Community Empowerment Act, which provides new opportunities, new powers for communities, and there's a number of other statutes that we've done that in the last 20 years, the level of awareness out there about these opportunities is still very limited. Even today, for example, 15 years after the Land Reform Act and Community Right to Buy, there's some communities don't know anything about it. And of course, the Community Empowerment Act extended the rights in that regard. So what more can be done to enhance the level of awareness about these opportunities? I mean, what do you think are the best approaches to that?
So again, we have, we work with different groups. The two that I've mentioned, we've got the National Action Group as well, and who can help us understand what are the best ways to really ensure that people understand that these are things that are available to them. So there's probably more that we can do, but like I say, we have, for areas that we know that might not have realised the opportunity through this, we've specifically tasked the two organisations, COS and the Community Development Centre, to really work with areas of, for instance, of disadvantage and areas of multiple deprivation, to go out and to try and proactively much more work and engage with communities so that they understand that these are things that they need to do. I think there's also an issue around capacity. It might not necessarily just be about ensuring that we make sure people know about this, because if the capacity is not there, then there's something that's a gap that continues to be felt. So I think there is, and I think this was one of the issues that has come up through the town centre review, is that we need to make sure that we're building up capacity in communities so that they have the ability to use these tools and these levers to enable them to have the impact that has been intended. So it's one thing to have these things in place, it's quite another for a community to be able to use them, and therefore that becomes incumbent on government of all levels to make sure that communities are empowered and have the capacity supported so that they can make use of those tools. And we continue to promote these bits of legislation through community development networks as well. So I said in my opening remarks that that these things only work on the basis of the networks that we have and the partnerships that we have. So it's really important that we use those networks to further push out these messages to our communities. And of course, there's probably a role for all of us as MSPs to make sure that our communities that we represent know that these are options when they present to us challenges or barriers in their community. So I think there's probably no one answer, but lots of answers and lots of ways in which we could be using all of our influence, all of our networks to make sure that communities understand that these are opportunities there for them.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Keith.
Thanks, Convener. Obviously, the committee has been looking at a piece of legislation, in particular parts 3 and 5 of the legislation and all the mechanics around it. But I think the most important thing is, where does the gold dust lie? Where has there been a community that actually feels they've been empowered by this legislation? And one example that's been mentioned is the Highland one, which I think was community out west when they'd taken over a public convenience. But more importantly, at the end of that process, they felt they had a real say in their community. They felt empowered by it. And I just wonder, what can the government do to try and, as well as the different things which this committee will suggest in its recommendations as to how technically and mechanically things can be improved, what can be done by the government working with local authorities to proselytise on that outcome where communities actually feel empowered by it, which of course is the intention of the Act?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of good examples. There's the one in the Highlands that I think you've referred to, and there's loads of other ones across the whole of the country where communities have felt empowered. That has been a positive experience for them. And the national group at the meeting tomorrow that Kathleen mentioned, they were meeting tomorrow, will be looking at calculating social value and how we measure outcomes. So there is currently work ongoing there to try and work out how do we capture some of this and how do we make sure that we can raise awareness of it, but also point and demonstrate the positive outcomes that come as a result of the good enacting of this legislation. So I agree that there is always room to do more. The group are going to be looking at how we calculate social value, how we measure outcomes, and I think this is aligned quite well with the National Performance Framework as well. If we're wanting to focus in on outcomes, we're wanting to have a country that is based and underpinned by the values of kindness and respect and dignity. If we want to have a wellbeing economy, then it's this territory that enables us to have that and make that happen. And therefore, it's incumbent not just on me in this part of government, but it's incumbent across the whole of government to recognise and understand that when you support and value your communities and trust them and work with them, that you can get good outcomes, not just in a social sense, but in an economic sense as well. And one other area of work that has started to take hold now and was mentioned in the programme for government has been the community wealth building approach, which I think we've spoken about at this committee before. So we've put some support into North Ayrshire through the Ayrshire Deals to further embed that. All credit to North Ayrshire, though, who have been at the vanguard of this. And we're also moving the community wealth building approach into other local authority areas and regional areas as well. And that's about ensuring that it's not an extractive model of economic policy that's in place, but something that enables the community to feel the wealth that's there and should be used and utilised for them, and give our communities far more of a stake in their local economy. And Neil McEnroy, who is on secondment from the Centre of Local Economic Strategies to the government, is part of the group that Kathleen chairs as well. So there's a number of areas of government that are pulling on this area of work, and there's opportunity. But I think, and hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the ways in which we can really try to promote the outcomes and the sense of empowerment that communities should feel as a result of the legislation.
Thanks for that. And just to say, I think two of the words that you've used, Cabinet Secretary, nurture and culture, are probably more important in this than some of the technical changes we might make. But that culture, the idea that a community feels through whatever process that they've been empowered by it, is really important. And it's trying to get that message out is really important. So going back, though, to one of the points that was made earlier, if you can nurture that culture to get people to think actually what they've done there made a real difference, because like you said, it can be intangible, it can mean increased community resilience and a real sense of ownership. On the culture side of it, going back to the local authorities, it'll often be the case, not unreasonably, that councils, being bureaucracies, will respond with a process-driven response rather than a nurturing response. And it's how you can affect that kind of change. And I know that you're not in a position, you don't want to be in a position of just telling local authorities this has got to be done in collaboration. But just on the point about one point of contact, and that point of contact being somebody that can actually affect that change. We've heard in the committee of situations where councils say, well, you can go to anybody. You know, if it's a leisure and recreation thing, you can go to someone. That's not really satisfactory. I think most people that have worked in local authorities would know. And if you look at, by contrast, if you're an MP, an MSP, or even a councillor, there's a specific track for how your representations in the council are delivered, and there's real organisational weight behind that. So I suppose it's how you get that real organisational weight behind a request for either participation or community asset transfer, and how you get councils to look upon that as a real opportunity for them. And so I suppose both on the culture and nurture things, I would be quite keen to see if the government could do this kind of proselytising, going around different councils and communities to say this is what we're trying to achieve, and keeping their eye on the prize of actual empowerment. And I suppose the question is how the government can best do that.
Yeah, and again, there probably will be lots of different ways that we could do that. In terms of answering more directly the question, what you said there around, trying to unlock some of the bureaucratic structures that we put in place, and whether that's national government, local government, NHS, whatever, there's all whole manner of bureaucracies that we then expect our communities to try and navigate through and judge them on the basis that they know all that, and that maybe sometimes doesn't feel that that's very balanced. But in the course of the last 10 months, what did we see? Well, we saw folk roll up their sleeves, regardless of who they were, what organisation they came from, focus on the task in hand and get on and tackle that. And I can't remember if I've used this phrase at this committee, but it's one that I'm borrowing from, that I heard from Sally Thomas from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, when she captured it really well by describing what we saw over the last 10 months of no egos, no silos, no logos. So people didn't really bother who they were representing or what bit of the world they came from. They were just tackling the issue and working in partnership. And that meant working with communities, it meant working with the third sector, it meant working with local government, national government, or third sector, whatever. And as a result, we saw some phenomenal things happen, really positive outcomes. And that's what prompted us, myself and Shirley-Ann Somerville, to establish the Social Renewal Advisory Board to try and capture some of that good practice so that we use this as an opportunity to not go back to the old ways of doing things, the I-Beam culture, but instead capture this and see if we can use this as a moment to try and use it to push forward that approach. So the Social Renewal Advisory Board will be reporting back to us fairly soon. And I mention that because that board was tasked with explicitly about how do we capture some of that good practice and use that to try and drive momentum and to see that become the way that we just do business across the country. That's one way we can answer that question, and hopefully some of the recommendations or thoughts that that board will bring forward will enable us to work through how we do that. And you know, I think there's lots of other ways we've talked about as well through the local governance review. There's other things, but I think it is about ensuring then going forward that while we on one level will be content and happy enough to see that there will be a point of contact in an authority or whatever, we have to make sure that we dive down a wee bit more deeply into that about what the quality of that offer is and making sure that communities are properly supported and able to navigate through some of the systems. And another area that I would point to, the other local authority that I think is a really good example of good practice is East Ayrshire, led really effectively by Fiona Lees until I think, you know, fairly soon before she retires. But she, from the top, led that council by reminding all of the folk across the council that if we are saying that there's a barrier to a community to doing something, then what is that barrier? And 9 times out of 10, it's been a barrier that we ourselves as a council have put in place. And if we've put it in place, then we can remove it. So she was really effective in trying to instill a culture across that authority that was about, well, you know, what's my default answer to a community? My default answer is yes, and then we work out how we make it happen. And I think that leadership is also really important. So it's important for us to have the legislation, the national guidance, the leadership in place, and all the different things that flow from that. But it's really important to see that leadership at a local area, and we have that. We have Fiona Lees, we've got Karen Reid up in Perth and Kinross with the Perth offer, all of them realising just how important it is to empower your communities and to do that by changing the culture of the authority as well. I think authorities are really up for that. I think there's also work that we need to do across our public bodies though as well. And that's probably a far longer answer than you were expecting, but I'm sorry about that.
Well, thanks very much. One last point is that just to say that, and I agree with you about Fiona Lees, and there's some fantastic leadership in our local authorities. One of the cliches that we use these days is, what does success look like, which is a bit of a tiresome phrase. But I suppose for me, the woman that spoke to us about the transfer of the public convenience in the Highlands, success looks like her face when I asked her if she felt they'd been empowered subsequently, because before that it was all about the transactional nature of it. And, you know, she certainly felt she'd been empowered. However, going back to Alexander Stewart's point, and I'm sorry to end on a slightly downbeat note, is it not the case that most successes have come about where there's been a coincidence of interest, i.e. councils looking to offload an asset which the community then sees that it values and then transfers to itself? I'm not saying that's not legitimate, but suppose the test of the legislation will be where there's not that coincidence of interest. I wonder if that's a concern for your Cabinet Secretary.
Can I ask you to make the answer quite brief, Cabinet Secretary, please?
Sorry, yes, a point. Thank you. So there could be something in that. I do think, though, it's about how you look at it. If councils and communities are working well and effectively together, then that is better. That's always going to be better. There has been 119 successfully agreed asset transfers, so that's good progress, and the others that have been put in place are kind of being worked through. So I think we have to look at this optimistically as well, and we don't want, and I've heard directly from communities that have said that they feel like it's not been, an asset transfer has not been empowering, it's been feeling like it's been something quite disempowering. So we don't want that to be the case, and so we'll have to guard against that. But I think on the whole, we have to look at this optimistically, that communities are wanting to take control over their local areas, and they are working with communities and councils, and they are making that happen. And councils are recognising that when they do work with their communities, that they can inspire better and positive outcomes. And you can see, so you heard from North Ayrshire again at the vanguard of community wealth building, COSLA led from the front from President Councillor Evison, wanting to really embed a local governance review approach that empowers our communities as well. So I think we have to be optimistic. I think, though, we have to guard against those examples that you've spoken about, and where we do see successes, where people work together in collaboration. And what will also be important, though, is that work that Kathleen spoke about around the social return on investment, to make sure that we do ensure that that is given the status that's required to enable councils, public bodies to take a much more balanced approach to where the benefit may lie from something that's been transferred, or an asset that might need to be requested. So I'm going to look at it optimistically. I think there's a lot of momentum and motivation in the system and the organisations that we work with. We have good evaluations that tell us what the legislation is working how it's intended. It's still fairly early. We've got a national group that's looking through how do we further drive forward improvement, and we've got councils that want to be part of that. And we've also got a moment in time post-COVID where we're thinking about how do we rebuild our country. And we've seen how well we do when we trust our communities. So all of those ingredients have to mix together to make something that I hope ensures that we have empowered communities going forward. And that will enable our country to recover. That will ensure our long-term resilience. And that means at national government level, we have to make sure nationally that we're leading that drive and ensuring that everyone is part of that.
Thank you very much. And finally, Annie Wells.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would just like to ask a question on asset transfers and whether the Cabinet Secretary believes that there's a socio-economic trend in the types of communities that are seeking an asset transfer, whether are they more likely to be wealthy communities or areas with high professional people living there.
So kind of answered in some of the previous questions that we recognise that there may be capacity issues, which is why we've specifically tasked COS to look at areas where there may be deprivation or other barriers, to make sure that we can support communities to build up capacity and to realise the opportunity that exists in this legislation. So I think it's a point that we recognise that we want to try and fix and sort, and that's why we've taken action to do that and to try and remedy that. And again, the work of the group will be acutely aware of some of the inequalities that persist in our country and how we need to make sure that this legislation is felt equitably. But I hope that demonstrates that we're being proactive in trying to tackle that.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. And just to touch on another subject Andy Whiteman had brought up earlier about the appeals process. If there was an appeals process, which body do you believe would decide on the appeals?
So I also said to Andy Whiteman that if we were that the evaluation from Glasgow Cali almost said that because the numbers of participation requests are quite low, that sometimes that doesn't enable us to take definitive conclusions from that. But we've not ruled out appeals, but we would have to build an appeal system and work out how that was best realised. But at the moment, we are not ruling it out, but we're monitoring the situation as to whether or not that would be the best route forward, and how that might, and what that would look like, would have to be decided upon. And I think at the moment it's probably too early, but it's not something that we would want to rule out indefinitely, I don't think. But you would have to build it. You would have to work out what the best approach was. So it's not without its complexities.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'm content. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that completes today's evidence session. But before we go, can I just reiterate the request for a feedback from the meeting that's taking place tomorrow about ALIOS, the further discussion on ALIOS. That would be very helpful for the committee.
Yeah, I think there's a range of things, but I think the Kathleen and Malcolm, I'm sure, will be able to give us an update on that.
Thank you very much. So thanks to yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and your officials for taking time out to speak with us today. You can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon, but I remind committee members that we remain in public for the next item. Thank you again. Agenda item 5 is consideration of negative instrument 419 as listed in the agenda. I refer members to paper number 4. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 22nd of December and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Do members have any comments on the instrument? Sarah.
Thanks very much, Convener. I was just wondering if it would be possible for us to write to the Scottish Government and ask for an update on progress on this issue. I'm not going to be speaking against the motion today, but it's certainly an issue that I've had concern from constituents about. People, for example, being in temporary accommodation, whether it's accommodation or having to leave during the day as the accommodation they're in is to get cleaned. And it's something that people are very worried about because it pushes them back out onto the streets, particularly in these difficult months in terms of the winter and the cold. It's not going to help their health. And it'd be good to know how many people have been able to move into permanent housing having been in temporary accommodation over the last few months. It is exceptional circumstances, and I thought the report about the work being done by the group of people working together with the Scottish Government to look at improvements to the initial draft that was presented earlier, I think that's been really good. But I'm just very keen to see an update on what is happening with homelessness. I've heard a mix locally, a lot of money being spent by the council to look after people in temporary accommodation, hotel accommodation. It's just to see what happens next, given that the pandemic is clearly going to be with us for some months yet. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, I don't see there have been any problems with sending that letter. That sounds like a sensible thing to do. Okay. Excuse me a minute. Do any other members have comments? If not, I invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to this instrument. Are we agreed? That is agreed, and that concludes the public part of this meeting. And we'll resume the meeting in private in Microsoft Teams. I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. Thank you. You can exit the meeting in the usual fashion.